Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to make a start. I'm Sam Richardson. I'm Director of the Coastal Tourism Academy, and I'm chairing today's session. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Coastal Tourism Academy, we support businesses and destinations to sustainably develop their visitor economy. And we work with everything from port cities like Southampton to seaside resorts and coastal rural areas. My work focuses on collaboration, partnerships, national engagement, and raising awareness of coastal issues, particularly working with government and national stakeholders for both the coast and the visitor economy. In relation to culture, I was a commissioner on the Local Government Association Culture Commission last year, their Cornerstones of Culture report. And this year we're leading on the Year of the Coast initiative. So shameless plug, I'm afraid, but please do get involved with Year of the Coast. Go yearofthecoast.com and you can find out more. We're based in Bournemouth, so part of the wider region, and I've previously worked in Southampton, so know the city well. And actually, my husband and his family have lived here for many, many generations, so lots of stories I know about Southampton. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here today. We have a fantastic panel to join the many great speakers we've heard from today. And before I ask the speakers to introduce themselves, just some quick information about the session. So this session is reaching across the region. If you're not expecting that, you're in the wrong room. We're not going to be taking questions directly from the floor, but those of you that have been to previous sessions, use Slido, and we'll have an opportunity to raise two of those with the panel later on. So without further ado, John, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yes, okay. Good afternoon. My name is John Denham. I'm here today as a director of the Southern Policy Centre. The Southern Policy Centre is a small regional think tank that's been going for about 8 years and has done a lot of work about regional strategy, local government devolution, poverty, creative industries, life sciences, future of city centres, many, many different aspects of regional issues, and I'll say a bit more about the region in just a moment. For those of a certain age, I was quite a long time ago now the Member of Parliament for this parish, and was a minister in the last Labour government. And about 8 years ago, I was for a couple of years the chair of the Southampton Cultural Development Trust. So it's fascinating to have been in at an earlier stage of the journey that we're on today.
Hello, I'm Emma Noyce. I am Hampshire County Council's Assistant Director for Regeneration and Growth, with a special focus on culture and communities. And if that is not job title bingo, I don't really know what is. So today is all about stories. So let me tell you my story. I live in Gosport, and we've heard today how Southampton is the greatest city. I would advocate for Gosport being the greatest town on the south coast. I absolutely love Gosport. But I am Southampton born and bred, and my earliest memory was, I must have been about 2 or 3, and it was sat on the front seat at the top, which is the prime seat, on a big red double-decker bus, crying my eyes out because my granddad had just taken me to see the Chinese New Year celebrations in Southampton city centre, and I was scared, so scared of those dragons. But that's my earliest memory. It's about culture and it's about family. In my career, I started off as a landscape archaeologist, so I have, I think, quite an ancient and profound perspective on how culture shapes communities, how people shape landscape through culture. I've managed a number of cultural or community-facing services, so coroners, registration, libraries, and in all of those, you see how culture manifests itself in the key points of people's lives: births, marriages, the way we treat our dead. But particularly in libraries, what really I'm absolutely passionate about is everyday culture. So a 6-month-old baby chewing the corner of a bored library book, a library book, a really everyday early engagement in culture. And now I'm Assistant Director for Regeneration and Growth, and what that means is my job is about joining the dots. My job's about the future of Hampshire and how we all work together, and recognising that culture exists in a system, it's not on its own. So the importance of our transport infrastructure, how climate change might affect things, spatial planning, employment and skills, and how culture can link and embed itself in all of those things. So that's my job now. And fundamentally, why I'm sat here on this seat today is because I think it's in the 2021 census results that a baby born today in one of the most deprived wards in Southampton is likely to have a 10-year less life expectancy than a baby born in one of Hampshire's most affluent areas. And our job is to change that through culture, and we can do that. So that's why I'm here.
And Victoria?
Hello everyone, I'm Victoria Pomeroy. I'm the CEO of The Box in Plymouth, and Plymouth is in the same region as Southampton, even though it feels like it's many miles away, given the issues about travel in this country. The Box in Plymouth is a new hybrid cultural organisation. It's part museum, part gallery, part archive, and it reopened in 2020 after a massive £47 million regeneration and refurbishment. Now, I can't take any credit for any of that, and since the Box opened, right in the midst of the pandemic in 2020, we've had 400,000 plus visits. But prior to my arrival, I arrived in October 2021, I was the founding director of Turner Contemporary in Margate. So cultural-led regeneration is in my DNA, and my aspirations and ambitions for the Box in Plymouth are absolutely enormous, and I'd love it if all of you here today are able to come and see what's happening in Plymouth. There's real transformation there, using culture, but so much about transformation is really about people and about our communities, and that's where I think working with artists, working with the past, looking at the present, we can work collaboratively and ensure that transformation really supports everyone's lives and helps everyone to realise their potential.
Thank you. So we've got a really good mix of experiences and expertise here on the panel. And this is about reaching across the region, and Southampton isn't an island. There isn't an iron wall around here, so people come and go across the region, and it's part of a really dynamic ecosystem within the region. So John, to start with you, please. How can we best work together for the benefit of everyone, rather than just the single place?
I think the critical thing to do is to tell the really compelling story about our region that's there, that is barely articulated because we're so fragmented. In the Southern Policy Centre 3 or 4 years ago, and after various devolution deals had failed, we thought this actually hasn't happened because nobody knows what the region is, nobody knows what they want a devolution deal to do. And so we sat down with an exercise and we put end to end the various strategy documents of local economic partnerships, county councils, city councils, and we said to ourselves, if you put these end to end, do you get a regional strategy? And at first sight, the answer was no, because everybody was parochial, everybody talked about their own area, everybody used different language. But when we stood back from them a bit, we said, actually, there's a hell of a story trying to get out here. We've got 3 waterfront cities. We've got 6 complementary universities. The economics is well integrated. There's about 1.5, 2 million people, so it really counts. There's a tremendous cultural and heritage offer. It's all set in this most amazing natural environment on land and at sea. This is obviously Southern Water, hadn't got the memo at that point, but potentially a wonderful environment. Great connections with the UK, with the rest of the UK, with Europe, the rest of the world. There's a region here that makes sense. And we've been trying ever since to tell that sort of regional story. Now, I'm not talking about something with rigid boundaries. The boundaries are fuzzy. If you talk about life sciences, it's one sort of thing. If you talk about marine and maritime, it's another. If you talk about creative industries, it's a different one. But you still keep coming back to that core story. And if you think about it, there's loads of places that have got a city on the seaside. There's not many places with 3 cities set in that natural environment with our advantages and our strengths. There's nowhere else like it in the UK. There's nowhere else like it in Europe. So my point, I think, really, Sam, is we don't diminish any of the individual stories of Southampton, Portsmouth, Gosport. We enhance them by saying we're part of this larger picture. So one of the ways we do it is we actually try to develop a shared story and a shared language, and therefore a shared pride in this particularly tremendous part of England that we come from.
Thanks, John. And same question to you, Emma, please.
And a similar answer from me. Okay, so in terms of how we can best work together as a region, I think the first question is, well, should we work together as a region? I mean, we heard this morning that actually sometimes we do what's easiest rather than what's right, and actually it would be really easy just to build our walls and say, actually, we've got a really sensible unit here. It works politically, it works for funders, so let's just deal with that. But of course, that's not the right answer, and it's not the right thing to do, is it? Boundaries matter to politicians, they matter to funders, they matter to organisations, but they don't matter to people. And if you've got a resident of Woolston or Weston, they will want to go to Royal Victoria Country Park for some green space and maybe the fireworks night there. It doesn't matter that Royal Vic is actually in Hampshire's geographic boundary rather than Southampton's. And I think also in terms of needing to work together, we've talked a lot this morning about the cruise ship market. Cruises are not the only show in town. So although we've got like 2 million people coming in through cruise ships and going off to the Med and coming back 2 weeks later, the population of Southampton, I think, is something like 250,000 people. The population of Hampshire is 1.3 million people. So there are 1.3 million people on the doorstep, ready to engage, ready to spend money, ready to visit Southampton. And likewise, we've got residents all over Southampton who are really keen to get out into the countryside. And I think it's that strength we have as a region. We have got coast, we have got city, we have got countryside. And that is really, really unique, and it's very, very special. So I think there's something about, actually, yes, it makes sense on so many levels to work together. And of course, all ships sail on a high tide, don't they? So we talked a little bit about the fact that it could very easily descend into competition. And sometimes when we're doing funding bids, we are competing with each other. So exactly as John said, it's about that shared narrative. How do we find strength in a shared voice? Understanding what each other's strategies are, understanding what each other is trying to achieve, really understanding what unites us. So the fact that digital and creative tech is really important in Southampton. It's also really, really important in Rushmore and in Basingstoke and in that kind of London territory, coming down from London. But also, what makes us special? What makes us unique? How do we make sure that we don't lose that very, very special identity that Southampton has, that really special identity that Winchester has, Portsmouth, all of the different places in our region. So I think there's something for us about how we work together to understand what we share, but also understand what we think makes us different as well.
Thank you. Victoria, you've got quite a different perspective, and the work in the Turner Contemporary in Margate completely transformed the region. So learning from that experience, what would you share in terms of how to make it work?
So Margate is a small seaside coastal town with high levels of deprivation, and when the idea was mooted by Kent County Council to put an art gallery in Margate, there was a sort of uproar from certain quarters that why shouldn't an art gallery go to Canterbury? So that says quite a lot about people's perceptions about culture. But the fact was that J.M.W. Turner had actually spent quite a lot of time in Margate as a child, and he repeatedly went back there and made some of his greatest paintings in Margate and on that North Kent coast. So I think it was just really sticking to that vision and keeping really clear the focus on what the gallery was there to do. And it now seems some distance because, the gallery has been open for more than 10 years and has sort of reimagined Margate. And people who were doubters and skeptics all those years ago have really come round to the idea that culture really works in a seaside town like Margate. And Margate now is often cited, I read about it all the time, as I'm sure other people do, as a place where cultural-led regeneration has worked. Now, within that, there are all sorts of other issues around, is it regeneration or is it gentrification? And I think at the heart of regeneration, everything needs to be about people, because we can put up lovely buildings, we can change the public realm, but actually regeneration is about people. And I think that's, for me, one of the most important things, how we engage with communities. And for me, moving from the East Kent coast to Plymouth, which is, huge different geography, and it's a very different context being in Plymouth, but that importance of how the cultural sector works with local communities, how politicians work with communities, how we all work with one another, and how we have respect and grow trust for each other. And I think, from my experience, that we have to be able to communicate and speak to one another. And sometimes that's really challenging because we can all be in our own bubbles. We can all get on a sort of tram line of trying to get from A to B. Building a big capital project, for instance, often means you just have to get from here to here in a very short period of time. But I think communication in all senses of that word is really something. And how we collaborate and how we partner. And collaboration and partnership, can be challenging, and I'm sure we'll come on to discuss that. But actually, if we've built that trust, if we have respect for one another, it's easier to make that happen. And I think, for me, one of the important things about regeneration and using culture to drive regeneration is having a really bold and ambitious vision. Don't settle for this when you can have this. And I think you just have to really be ambitious. And when I think about the artists who I've been privileged to work with over, a long career working in the arts, artists always come up with the most creative solutions, and they have real ambition. And I think we all need to have that ambition and those aspirations for our communities, but also listen and be in that listening mode around our communities and what's going to work best, and how we then develop a sense of that regional aspect, whether it's a small region or a wider region, because Plymouth is part of this wider region of the southwest, which joins up with Hampshire. And so we've got a huge region, and I think it's also how we talk to policymakers, and particularly those people who are London-based, how we get them to come to places outside the centre, because actually, Southampton is a centre in its own right. Plymouth is a centre in its own right. If we draw a different circle around Southampton, Southampton is smack in the middle of it. If we draw a circle around Plymouth, look what's around Plymouth. There's a lot of sea, admittedly, but the geography of places, we have to really think about that context.
Fabulous. There's lots to think about in there, isn't there? And you led us very nicely into what are the challenges that we face in starting to do this together. And of course, collaboration is never easy. It's I speak from experience in saying it can be a challenge. Emma, let's start with you. What would you say are the key challenges as working together across the region?
Okay, I'm probably sat in the middle of a room full of people who spend much of their time battling with some of these challenges. There are a few. I think the ambition is there, the words are there, but the action, it's really, really hard to move to action on some of this stuff. Some of it is due to the kind of the governance structures. So when we talk about funding can be really, really fragmented, and even in this example, we are in a different Arts Council funding zone in Hampshire than you are in Southampton in terms of our relationship manager. So in terms of trying to do things together, that makes it a little bit tricky, and then we get into that competing for the same pots of money rather than collaborating, which is again where that shared narrative comes in really, really useful, because if we've got that shared narrative, then we're speaking with one voice. I don't even know if I've got the words to kind of explain this, but there's something about how you tread that line between culture being a really, really hyper-local thing. Culture matters to neighbourhoods. It matters to individual peoples, and communities come together through culture at a really, really local level. But also it's a regional thing. So it's how we do that regional piece over whilst respecting that actually we want much of our cultural and creative activity to be bottom-up, to be community-led. There's something about chasing too many rainbows. So culture ticks so many boxes, doesn't it? We kind of talk about culture in terms of economic development, in terms of health and well-being, in terms of quality of place and place shaping. And we spread ourselves quite thinly, and we're always trying to tick different boxes. So it's about actually what our focus is and what our priority is in this space. And then it would probably be wrong to say that actually in terms of one of the challenges in coming together and working together, it would be wrong not to mention the cost of living. And I think something Carolyn mentioned this morning is absolutely profoundly true, that local authorities who often have some sort of leadership or convening capacity to bring people together, there is a hollowing out going on. And when really, really tough decisions are being made about whether we can spend money on some really statutorily essential things, culture is often seen as a non-essential. I think we all in this room have talked all day about actually culture is part of our health and well-being. We've talked about a parallel NHS. So it isn't non-essential. It's not a nice to have, but in a funding mechanism, it often is. So I think there's something around that. So there's something about how we share a commitment that we are going to embed culture and creative industries into all of our strategic work across the work we do, not just in a very narrow sector-driven way.
Thanks. Victoria, the same question to you, if that's okay.
So I absolutely agree. There are a lot of issues that are cultural, which impacts on how we actually work together and prevents us from being what we want to be sometimes. I think there's issues about time and resources, which also Emma's touched upon, but I think a lot of people in the cultural sector are under-resourced in terms of maybe staffing, but other people working in the NHS, say, or education are similarly. And I think, that the lack of resources sometimes, whilst I think lack of resources can drive creativity, I think lack of resources also impedes, to some extent, what we are able to do. And I think geography as well. I mean, when I worked in Kent's a massive county, and actually getting the cultural sector in Kent to meet up from time to time was a real challenge. So that geography is really important. And what I'm finding in a place like Plymouth is you can actually meet everyone. Everyone can walk across the city, so all the leaders of the cultural sector can get together. But if you think about the cultural sector more widely across this whole region, well, to get back to Plymouth for me on a train tonight is probably about 4.5 hours on a train. So it's a long way. And I think we have to really think about those issues of geography. Obviously, COVID in some ways has enabled us all to work differently, and we can talk in virtual meetings, and that's how I've come to meet colleagues on this panel previously. But I think it's also, there's nothing like meeting face to face and having those direct conversations, particularly when they're driven by ideas and ambition. And I think the final point I'd just make is about leadership. So in lots of cities and towns right around the UK, we have brilliant leadership, but we also have to reflect on sometimes that leadership, for whatever reason, isn't quite what it should be. And I think leadership sometimes really presents challenges. And I think we need to really think about leadership within the cultural sector in particular, but in all sectors, and really focus on how we can support leaders to take on that breadth of stuff, really, that is required to run cultural organisations successfully at this moment in time. It's true also of those working in local authorities, in the health sector, in the education sector, but I think leadership is really important and sometimes undervalued, and how we give people and enable them to have the time to develop their leadership skills.
Lots of key themes keep popping back up, aren't there? This is great. John, you've been right at the face of this for years now. What would you say the challenge is to actually delivering at this point? And
I think one of the things we need to be careful about the language that we use, and actually challenges may be a problem. If you don't see collaboration as problem solving rather than problem creating, you're probably not going to do it. If talking about collaboration means adding something to somebody's job when they're already stressed, and as Emma says, we've lost half the staff that we had 10 years ago who could have done this stuff. And so actually talking about this positively as problem solving and enhancing what we do and making all our lives easier is a critical starting point of any of those discussions. Then I think a second thing is that does need, and leadership comes in here, some clear thinking. We don't all have to collaborate on everything all of the time. We had a seminar back in the autumn. I wasn't there, but I'm going from the reports that were done down at Fareham College about the film industry, which is actually a quite small but growing part of our economy, which is almost recognised by nobody. It's not in anybody's economic strategy. It's not any LEP strategy. And there's lots of small companies, average 2.5 people working for them, but it's growing. And what came out of that discussion was that in one sense, the region, isn't it, because it's a sort of very well networked industry where you work with people all over the place. On the other hand, there were a couple of areas, if there was a film office for the sort of region that I was talking about, that would make sense in terms of having a small institutional arrangement that could really sell the film industry and get this sort of central south area known for what it's doing. But in other areas, and there was also talk about bringing more FE colleges in. Universities are already pretty good in this sort of area, but bringing FE colleges. But other things, they didn't really want to be done on a regional basis. So I think it's problem solving if you work out the thing you need to do that's going to help. Just a couple of other things quickly, I think. In a previous session, I heard Don John talking about the need for a plan. I think that's often the case. We have lots of meetings where people talk vaguely about what needs to be done. I'm sure a theme throughout the conference has been that creative industry is part of well-being, as well as being about place, as well about the economy. We now have strategic health bodies, integrated care boards. Declare an interest, I'm a non-executive director of the Hampshire and Isle of Wight one. Actually, we need to sit down and say, what actually is our engagement going to be with those bodies? So not talk vaguely about health and well-being, but actually say, work out how that relationship will work. Final thing is create spaces for partnership where it is possible for people to say, without feeling bad about themselves, no, I'm sorry, our organisation is not going to be able to do that. It's too difficult. And Emma will sort of half know what I'm talking about. Hampshire, if you suggest to Hampshire County Councillors that the future of Hampshire as a county council is in doubt because of some sort of devolution deal, you will not get anywhere. And there is absolutely no point in trying to push water uphill when people have got their different institutional interests, and Southampton does, and Portsmouth does, and the district councils do. So it ought to be permissible. I mean, sometimes we'd rather talk about how we're all going to work together than create an environment where somebody can say, I'm sorry, that's going to be really too difficult for me to do that. I'm not going to do that. If we don't trust each other enough to share when it's really hard, we'll never make any progress.
Absolutely. Collaboration where it makes sense. And positivity, I like that. That's a good way, particularly given the conference is called Southampton Forward. We should be looking positively forward. Victoria, in your experience, what are the strengths of Southampton in reaching across the region, and perhaps drawing on your experience from other areas in terms of how to leverage that Southampton within the wider region?
Well, I think I feel very ill-equipped to speak about Southampton, so I might actually talk about Plymouth for a moment, if you'll bear with me, but hopefully there's something useful that is of use to Southampton. But I think, Plymouth is on a journey, and there are lots of similarities between Plymouth and Southampton, just looking at the stats. In Plymouth, the infrastructure has been massively improved, particularly the cultural infrastructure, over the last decade. And finally, with the opening of the box only in September 2020. And I think what has happened is that various agencies have come together, including Heritage Lottery Fund, Arts Council and the City Council, really to work in partnership to think about how they are going to deliver on a strategic plan. And I think that point about vision and plan is really, really important. But the City Council in Plymouth really had a vision about using culture, and they have worked collaboratively with the national agencies to make that happen. What also happened was that something called Plymouth Culture was established, which brings together and has a sort of overview of culture across the city, but really helps strategically support not only the cultural and creative industries, but also brings in HE and FE businesses. And I think sometimes within the cultural sector, we can be kind of slightly locked into one way of thinking. And actually, so much more can happen if we collaborate with those people in other sectors. So I think for me, having an entity like Plymouth Culture in the city has really, really helped the city reach its potential around culture. And I should declare an interest because I'm on their board, but you know, I do think having an umbrella organisation which has the overview and also then can start to join up some of the dots, because a lot of this is about joining up the dots. So how, you know, we might work with the John Hanser Gallery next door, and I know Woodrow, and, you know, I think it can happen and it will happen, but it also takes time, and things don't just happen overnight. There's a lot going on in the world at the moment. There's a huge amount of change. There's a cost of living crisis. There are all sorts of uncertainties. So I think, you know, time and how one works with communities, particularly those communities who might not be engaged in culture, it does take, in my experience, you know, we're talking years, not a few months.
Yeah, it's not always a quick win, is it? John, your perspective on what are the strengths of Southampton in reaching across the region?
Well, I think actually Southampton's, I mean, things have come on a bit. I mean, I can remember, it's quite a long time ago, the standing joke was that if you got into a taxi at Southampton station, the taxi driver would ask you what you'd come here for, with a blank incomprehension that anybody would. And I think things have changed enormously. Look, I think the truth is that Southampton has changed enormously over the last 10 to 15 years in the extent to which there's a concerted attempt to tell the city's story better. That's an important part of reaching across the region. The second thing is that we have many institutions within the city that are on a day-to-day basis reaching across the region and beyond. I mean, if you look, and the port is a global enterprise. The airport is certainly a European-wide enterprise. Our universities have huge regional footprints. Whatever else they do, very few employers of any size within the city draw their workforce solely from people living within the city, so people are sharply aware of what's round about. Where I think we need to strengthen is in some of our, firstly, our storytelling about the city as a whole, so we all talk about the same strengths, we all talk about the same things. And the second area, I think, is just in some of these institutional links we have with people. I sometimes say that we and this is backed up by some survey work with leaders across the region, we cooperate better in practice than we do in principle. In other words, if COVID comes, the quality of partnerships, and we're not unique in this happened all over the country, but when COVID came, all sorts of rules got changed, people worked together in different ways, did things in new, innovative ways, and that was not just within the city, that was quite across the region. And we did groundbreaking things in health around research, the spit testing for COVID that was pioneered at the university, all done incredibly quickly in ways that before the pandemic people would have said, you're not going to be able to do that. But get people to sit down and come up with a formal arrangement to cooperate with other people, and somehow it seems to be much more difficult. So I think we need to say, actually look at how much of this city is inevitably collaborating on a regional basis and thinking regionally. The Mayflower Theatre doesn't exist because there's an audience in Southampton that goes to the Mayflower Theatre. You know, it comes from a huge region. It's serving that. So parts of the city are already doing that. Get them to tell their stories more strongly. And then secondly, look at the way we cooperate in practice and say, let's build some better institutional structures to make the best of that, so that we're not, if you like, having to reinvent the wheel when the next emergency or the next pandemic comes along.
And let's just do it. Great, brilliant. Emma, you've got a lot more experience, I suppose, of Southampton and its strengths. Again, what would you say its strengths are working across the region?
Well, speaking as a kind of slightly on the outside of Southampton, so not a resident, but somebody who knows and loves the city, I have never, ever been prouder of Southampton than I was last year in the bid process. I think that was the most incredible, inspiring thing that certainly happened in my lifetime to a city that I care about. And from that, Southampton is showing absolute leadership in the region in terms of momentum, in terms of its ambition, in terms of its vision and its leadership, and the diversity of its offer. And probably most important, the thing that Southampton is, I think the thing that the region really, really can learn from Southampton on is that grassroots kind of level of culture and creativity, and actually that what we heard this morning about communities taking charge. Southampton is doing that better than anywhere else I see at the moment in the region, and really, really proud of that. Certainly when you sort of talk about places, so one of my favourite conversations is with people like my colleagues and friends from the Arts Council who were talking about Aldershot a lot at the moment, and the fact that there's no cultural engagement in Aldershot. There is absolutely tons of cultural engagement in Aldershot in the Nepali community. It's just that it's not ticking the boxes that people fill out on forms. And I think Southampton has got so much to show the region in terms of how we understand what cultural engagement really is. I think in terms of other things in terms of the regional strengths, there is a shared commitment that our region should be a great place to live, work and play. And I think that commitment is shared across the leadership of the county, our unitary authorities, the Isle of Wight, the whole geography of the region. There is a package, there is an amazing package here. So I've talked about coast, countryside and city, but that tourism and visitor package, that is a destination. The region has got a destination offer, which is bigger than the city, although the city is incredibly important and has its own identity in that. And I think we talked this morning also about assets and capabilities, and we have fantastic assets as a region. So the heritage assets, the link between Southampton and Winchester from a particularly historical point of view, but also our green space, our country parks, the way we work together on that. So I think we've got a huge shared asset and capability that really does make our region stand out. And I think the last thing I'd say is the innovation. I think John's already talked about that, but absolutely that innovation. And there is stuff that Southampton can learn and grow. So in the latest census results, there are more creative industries in Basingstoke than there are in Southampton. Now, part of that, again, is around IT and digital creativity. But we can work together and we can learn from that. We can understand how to grow industries in places where, in other areas in the region, they're growing faster. So I think there is a huge amount to share in this space.
Huge amount of potential. You said live, work and play, and I was about to say we're missing visit, but you went there. Thank you. Fantastic. I think there's so much in that, really, isn't there, in terms of building on the pride and the momentum that was brought together through the City of Culture bid, and taking the positive look forward, be ambitious and just do it, and thinking on the bigger scale of how we learn from other places but work with other places at different levels depending on how it works for. We've got an opportunity now to have 2 questions from Slido. This is where it gets technical. Might go wrong, peeps. Okay. This is the most popular one, yeah. In an age where more and more people are shopping independently, can we market and champion independent shops such as East Street to appeal to tourists across the region? I'm going to say yes, definitely. But I should forward it to the panel. So would anyone like to answer that? Margate was fantastic for independent shops, microbreweries. I mean, it's done a fantastic job, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely Margate has embraced those independent retailers. And I think probably more places are doing that. When I think in what's happening in Devon and parts of Cornwall, there's huge amount of independent retailers. So I think it's just how we talk about a place. And I'm sure I don't know, I've been to Southampton on a few occasions, but it's usually just to see the art gallery or to go to John Hansard. But I think, for me, it is about how we support those retailers, how we promote them, and how we talk about them as part of that wider offer. But also it's how we, in those people who live in the city, use the retailers, because I think quite often there's this notion of not supporting them and thinking about tourism, but actually if us as residents to any particular place don't use what's on our doorstep, how can we expect other people to from other places? So I think it is about how we make the most of what's on in our neighbourhood, as it were, whether that's retail, culture, leisure, the countryside.
And it certainly brings out that sense of place, doesn't it? That's the key thing. Emma or John, would you like to add to anything to that?
I'll go with a hell yeah. I think absolutely. Southampton is a destination shopping place. So my two teenage boys in Gosport will jump on a train and come to Southampton to go shopping, and I think it's really exciting. But I think the best shopping destinations, and I think the best kind of city mini breaks, if we're going to go there, are places which have got that kind of regional pull, but also that really, really interesting maker, craft-based small business place to go. So you think of the lanes in Brighton, that kind of thing. So I think absolutely yes. And I think in terms of the future of our high street, there's also a piece around us in terms of both creativity, but also in terms of meanwhile use, pop-up animation of closed shopping units and retail units and things like that. So I think that's really, really important. So that's what
I'll just add a short point, which is completely second-hand. But if my daughter was here, she would, I think, answer it in this way, because until a couple of years ago, she was a cabinet member on Exeter City Council, and amongst her responsibilities was working with the small retail sector. So I think her answer would probably not just yes, but it's the relationship between the retailers and the council was critically important, because it was very much about how could the retailers and how could the council support the retailers to promote the independent sector, and not about how can the council promote the independent sector. And that sense of trying to empower people to make the change for themselves, which actually turned out sometimes to have ludicrously small amounts of money for an app or something of that sort that people could be shared. And so I think the answer is yes, but I think the question we then go is, right, who's going to take the lead and what's the role of different organisations? And I think this is a more general point probably about creative sector things. It's not about somebody up there promoting. It is about facilitating and empowering people to make the changes themselves. And I think that, again, that's going back to this theme of make this problem solving, not problem causing for people.
John, you've led us so brilliantly into the next question, you don't even realise. So the other question was, what organisations do you think should bring together the shared story, the shared narrative, and who should be accountable?
Well, let's divide that into two parts. I mean, this sort of event is about telling that shared story. I mean, we you can't hire somebody to tell the shared story, and that's what happened. You know, during the bid last year and all the rest of it, all of those meetings. Yes, not everybody's story got into the shared story, but it's how we do it. And I think that it is partly there is a role there. And I set out at the beginning what I thought the regional story is. I think you can develop that. But it is about bringing people together to say what's important about a particular place. Now, there is a role there, I think, for local authorities and other organisations to do that. What I'm stumbling with is the question of accountability. Because ultimately, if we want to tell a story, whether it's about the city, but hopefully about the wider region, we are all accountable for that. We all need to own the responsibility to tell that story. It's not a matter that Emma and her colleagues sort of sit there in Winchester and the Ashburton Court and going to write down the story and hand it down for the rest of us so we can learn it. It's not going to happen here at the City Council. So this really powerful storytelling does not come from the institutions telling the story. It comes from the people telling the story. That's why I mentioned the taxi driver earlier, because I think you would get a much more positive story from a taxi driver today than you would have got 20 years ago in that story. So I'm stumbling to say that we hold somebody accountable for delivering this. I think we have to say we are all responsible for thinking about this story, listening to what other people have said here today, and then being the people who propagate the story outside of that region. Some people in this room are, as it were, more important than others and have got more access to more resources or more platforms, so they should do it. But unless we all own it, it won't actually happen. It won't seem authentic either.
And I guess accepting that story is dynamic too. Emma or Victoria, would you like to add anything to that?
I suppose I just think that there has to be a plurality of voices, and the ownership of stories is everyone's. And actually, what we've seen so often in various places is that there is one narrative when there ought to be 10 or 20 narratives. So I think that for me, that plurality of voice is really important. And I think, having worked on a Canterbury bid years and years ago to be capital of culture, which sadly, was tipped to the post by Liverpool, that brought together so much collaboration and so much positivity and so much sort of sense of what the potential might be. So I think Southampton's in a brilliant place in terms of you've done all the sort of joint collaborative thinking. Well, you haven't done all of it because it's an ongoing journey. And I think just how you can engage with more members of the community and how you can really develop a narrative that shifts and changes all the time, because that's going to be important. There's not one fixed narrative that is forever. It has to keep evolving.
Thanks. Emma, do you want to?
I think it's 5 to 4 on a day that we've all been listening to lots of things. So that sounds like a really good question, but also scarily like some sort of essay question that I'm sat there going, how on earth will we answer that? But I think exactly this. I think there is something about this has to be a story that everyone owns. And I look at places like Albert Road in Portsmouth and the real kind of grassroots community vibrancy that place has developed through people just working together and going to the pub together and sort of deciding they're going to do a street festival and stuff like that. But also there has to be that kind of almost that strategic convening capacity. There's got to be capacity somewhere in the system for people to facilitate people coming together. And I know that in lots of the meetings that I've been to with Southern Policy Centre or others, I don't know how many freelancers we have in the room, or I don't know how many people are actually part of an organisation, authority, or a charitable trust. But it's a huge amount of time to spend talking, isn't it? If you're a freelancer, if you are dependent on making your own wages and then going to all these meetings to discuss this sort of thing, is a huge ask on your time. So I think we have to be really, really careful about how we bring people together, but also how we work with communities for them to kind of be masters of their own destiny in that sense. But yeah, so I think there is that, exactly as you say, that balance between what is community-led and what is actually needs that bit of strategic capacity to bring together.
Yeah, and I think it's accepting that there's those common threads, isn't it, that we will all agree on, but we will each dial up different messages depending on, it's a very diverse sector, isn't it? Right, quick fire round here, and then hopefully we can squeeze in a comfort break for everyone before the next session starts. So to finish today, if you had one piece of advice for Southampton, what would it be? Who wants to go first? Go on, Victoria.
I think be really ambitious, hold your nerve and just do it.
I think I'd say, because there's lots of really positive stuff about Southampton and the momentum and the investment, that it's important that Southampton is giving that message to this wider region that we've talked about, that Southampton sees itself as part of that region, and that by telling a stronger regional story, Southampton benefits, so does Bournemouth, so does Portsmouth, so does Winchester. So I think there's a real asset here because of all the work that's been done over the last couple of years, and to be willing to show that this is something that we want to share and spread with the wider region and not sort of hold to as our city because we've done this work so far. I think Southampton will gain enormously from that, and so will the region as a whole.
Thanks, Emma.
And I absolutely agree. I think it's just carrying on being brilliant, leading by example and doing everything that you're doing, but with that kind of outward-looking, open-armed approach.
Fabulous way to end, isn't it? Outward-looking, ambitious, bold, just do it and work together as part of a region. On point. Well done, panellists. Thank you very much to my panellists. I think a round of applause. They've all been fantastic. And they've stuck to the schedule, which is brilliant. So we have a few minutes if anyone wants a quick comfort break. And then we're back in here at 4:15 for the final session. So thank you very much, everybody.